The first time she stepped off the eastbound stage and onto the mud-soaked trail of black, the whole town stopped breathing, not because she was beautiful, but because she didn't belong. Hair pinned neat beneath a wool bonnet, dress hem dark, with river dust, and a grip on her suitcase like she expected it to be yanked from her hands. She stood out like a bruise on a preacher's collar. Nobody knew her name yet, but every mouth on the street whispered the same thing. That's the one he sent for, that scrawny girl, that's the bride. The man who met her didn't look much better off. Travis Reed, weary, 33, calloused, and sunworn, with a hitch in his step from a bad break 2 years back. Folks had expected a desperate man to send east for a wife, sure, but they hadn't expected him to bring back her, a girl to quiet, to thin, with eyes that moved like a deer in brush. He barely said 2 words, only touched the brim of his hat and helped her up onto the back of his wagon. No kiss, no proud smile, just a nod like business had been settled and now they had to live it. But that ride back to his land, it wasn't to a house, not even to a proper cabin. She didn't ask questions when the trail turned off the main road. She didn't protest when the wagon passed by to other homesteads, both with clapboard porches and smoke curling from chimney pipes, and she didn't say a word, not even when they stopped at the edge of a slope, where cottonwoods grew so thick the sun barely reached through. All she did was follow him, silent, straight back, as he walked them into that shaded tangle, and there, in the curve of a leaning sycamore, was a structure no settler could make sense of. It wasn't a house, wasn't even a shack. It looked more like a child's dream of shelter, logs tucked between the wide arms of the tree, lashed with rawhide and packed with mud, a roof patched with bark and pine thatch. From the road, it looked like part of the woods. Up close, it looked like desperation. No stovepipe, no chimney, no windows, just a cut slit in the bark wall, maybe big enough for a raccoon to squeeze through. He opened the crooked wooden door and gestured her in, and she went without a word. That first night, she slept with her boots on, curled near the embers of a fire pit dug into tethered floor. Travis gave her his blanket, sat with his back to the door and his shotgun over his knees. She hadn't even told him her full name yet. By the 3rd morning, word had already circled the settlement that Travis Reed was keeping a woman in a tree shelter, and by the end of the week, they'd started calling it the Squirrel Shack. They laughed loudly at the saloon on Sundays near the church steps. And most of all, when Travis rode in for supplies with his face turned down like he'd rather be anywhere else. "You build her a nest, Travis," one man hooted once. "What? Yowant tree babies, too." The barkeep wouldn't even take his coin the first time he tried to buy proper oilcloth, tossed it back like it was a joke. But inside that tree shelter, things were not as the town believed. Her name was Lenny, not short for Linda, not for Lynette, just Lenny. She'd come from Pittsburgh, raised by aunts who worked in factories and wanted her married off before 20. She was 22 now. Her hands were already calloused from work. And first thing she did when Travis left for town was unpack a leather-wrapped bundle. From the bottom of her suitcase, inside, tools, carving knives, bone needles, a roll of waxed string, and a thin notebook wrapped in cloth page filled with diagrams that didn't look like the doodles of some silly girl. They looked like plans. She didn't speak Mick to Travis those first days, not because she was shy, but because she was watching how the wind hit that tree when the cold came off the ridge, watching where the sun slipped through the canopy in the morning, watching which would burn slower, which drew in smoke, and slowly, without saying a word, she started changing things. By 4th day, the hole in the roof was gone, patched with overlapping sheets of bark, held down with creek mud and woven branches. She hollowed a venting hole above the pit, packed the edges with clay and ash. The air cleared, fine side stopped, smelling like wet dog. She stitched a draft seal into the crooked door using bark fiber and her own sure lining. The wind no longer hissed through the cracks at night, Travis noticed, but he didn't say anything yet. He only watched from the other side of the fire. She worked like she'd done it before. Because she had, back east, her aunts had mocked her sketches. Said no man wanted a wife who built like a boy, said no husband will tolerate a woman who climbed trees to test shelter design, but Lenny had learned, watching tanners stretch hides, watching factory engineers vent their heat lines, watching men throw away half their winter warmth just because they built their homes in the wrong direction. And this tree, this squirrel shack, it was perfect. Its boss was shaded in summer, but took full morning light through winter. The bark walls were denser than plank wood. The overhanging root nuts acted like natural braces. The limbs sheet, woven into the ceiling beams, didn't creak under snow weight. They absorbed it. And best of all, no one paid it any mind because everyone thought it was a joke. The richest family in town didn't even glance at it the first time they rode past. The male Ridges. 3 generations soft land-grabbing ranches, smug in their fine wool and polished boots, their horses shod with fresh iron. James and Mailage, the elder, had built his own home up on the bluff, wide-porched, 3 chimneys, even glass windows rated in from Missouri. He mocked Travis Reed openly. Still, playing house with a possum, Reed, he'd said once. Travis hadn't answered. He rarely did, but Lenny remembered that face because 2 weeks later, after a heavy snow, cracked the beams in 2 of the bluff homes, including a side porch at the male Ridge estate. Jameson came riding down to the edge of Travis's land with a false smile, and his eldest son in tow. Said they were just passing through. Said they thought maybe they'd seen smoke and wondered if Travis needed help. Lenny stepped out before Travis schooled, hair tied back, gloves on, no smile. She stood in front of the tree shelter like a sentinel. James and Laud, but his eyes did not. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. My, but ain't you cozy? She said nothing. Is that a cook fire I smell? He asked. You know, my wife's been asking about alternative builds lately. Some of these newer, what do they call it, sustainable styles. Lenny didn't move, but she saw his son staring, not at her, but at the corner seam of the roofline, where the rainwater runoff had been engineered to channel through a carved root right into a small barrel set beneath, not a drop spilled. You want to come in? She asked finally. Jameson blinked. She stepped aside just enough for them to see inside. No wood smoke, no black soot on the walls. Warmth without the smell of damp. A space insulated with hanging quilts, tucked pelts, layered moss. A sleeping cot lifted off the dirt using lished branches, even a rack for drying boots, all inside a tree. Jameson's smile stiffened. Remarkable, he said, but his son said nothing, just stared. They left soon after, but the next week, someone tried to buy Travis's land. Cash, more than it was worth, offered by a business agent who wouldn't say who hired him. Then someone else tried to sneak onto the land at night. They never reached the shelter. Travis caught them halfway through the cottonwoods, left them limping back with a warning slug in their saddle. But Lenny knew, she knew, they'd seen what she'd built, and now Simeon wanted it. The snow did not ease. It came heavier through December and thicker after the new year. Town roofs sagged, porches split. More than one settler was seen walking through town with frostburn on their ears, but out in that tree shelter beneath the sycamores. Lenny and Travis were warm, not rich, not comfortable, but warm and alive, and that fact alone. It started gnawing at the male ridges like a rusted nail. Under the skin, Lenny didn't speak off them, not to Travis, not aloud. She kept her words tight in her mouth and her eyes wider than most noticed. Butch watched. She saw how Jameson Male Ridge ranch hands passed the edge of their slope more often now. How the same rider circled back twice in one afternoon. How the same man who'd once mocked Travis now seemed to be cataloging, measuring the land with glances instead of tape. That tree shelter wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It had survived to heavy storms while 3 bluff homes showed cracked rafters. The coldest night of the year dropped below 0, and their fire pit still held heat by morning. Then one night, as wind howled and sleet lashed through the branches, there came a sound Lenny did not mistake for anything natural. A click, metal on wood, just outside. She rose silently, lifted her palm to Travis without a word, and motioned for him to stay seated. He'd taken to listening to her without resistance now, because everything she'd done so far had Worked, he obeyed. Huiged, she slipped her knife from under the cot, stepped barefoot across the packed earthen floor, and peered through the vent seam she'd widened earlier that month. What she saw confirmed what she already knew: a man crouched by the runoff barrel, touching the root-lined gutter with gloved fingers, tracing it like a blueprint. Linny didn't scream. She didn't step back. Instead, she tapped once on the wooden frame beside her head. The man looked up, locked eyes with her through the narrow slit. She held the blade up to the seam, let him see it, then backed slowly away, letting her face disappear into the dark behind her. The next morning, the runoff barrel was missing, the carved gutter torn, but it hadn't been a theft. It was spite, punishment for the message she'd sent. She knew it, and so did Travis. "They're not going to stop," he said that night. First time he'd spoken a full sentence in days. They want it, maybe not the shelter itself, but what's in it? How it works, they think they can buy it, Linny said. Her voice was low, like something smoldering. "Or break it and make me rebuild it for them." Travis looked at her. She wasn't just surviving. She was burning. Something in her had lit that day at the river bank, and it hadn't gone out since. She stood up, wrapped a scarf around her head, and pulled her coat on. "I'm going to the ridge. You'll get spotted," Travis said, stepping forward. "That's male vigilant." "No," she said. It was before he could speak again. She was out the door and gone into the snow. She came back 3 hours later, cheeks red with wind, gloves torn. But her eyes were shining with something deeper than fury. "They're building a copy," she said. And that's what changed everything, because it wasn't just some joke anymore, not some silly shelter to mock at the saloon. The male ridges had stripped bark from a sycamore higher up the ridge, tried to replicate the shape, even mimic the runoff gutter she'd crafted. But they'd built it too high, too exposed. The pitch was wrong, the angle shallow, and they'd done it with tired hands, not understanding the wood, not feeling it. They tried to take her idea, claim it, replicate it with Thuther, and from then on, Linny stopped playing quiet. She began modifying the tree shelter openly, boldly. She carved new vent slats in the upper wall, angled for heat conservation, dug 2 narrow trenches to divert outside runoff around shelter's root base, ensuring no ground freeze. She constructed a small reflector wall with flat stones angled just right to bounce heat back into the shelter's inner pit. Travis watched her with the look of a man watching something sacred. She even started drawing again, sketches in that notebook she always kept hidden. Designs, adjustments, but not just for the tree shelter, now for expansion. "You trying to build a whole town in the trees?" Travis said one evening, trying for humor. She looked at him without a smile. "If I had enough bark and time, I would." And still, the town laughed, but now it was quieter, nervous, because word had spread. A surveyor from down in Little Jasper had ridden through and stopped for warmth with Travis. When his horse threw a shoe, when he saw the tree shelter and how warm it stayed without smoke choking the roof line, he scribbled in his little field book for nearly 2 hours. He asked Linny a dozen questions. She gave him 4 answers, but those 4 were enough. 3 days later, someone from the male Richest state tried to buy the shelter again. This time directly. A young woman in fine gloves and a velvet-trimmed coat stepped down from a carriage. She stood at the edge of the slope and waited. She didn't knock, didn't shout, just waited until Travis stepped outside. She handed him a letter. "Mr. Mridge offers you $2, 0 and half a dozen head of cattle for the design and exclusive rights to construct similar units on his land." Travis read the letter, then handed it back. "My wife says no," he said. She'd been more comfortable somewhere with glass. The girl said stone. Maybe she chose this. The girl's smile was polite, but her eyes were the same as Jameson's, entitled, cold, and quietly angry. "Tell Mr. Melledge," Travis said, "that he can build anything he likes. But he won't be building this." When he stepped back inside, Linny was already layering soil and ash into the fire pit like armor. He didn't say a word, just knelt beside her and handed her more bark. Because now it wasn't about warmth or shelter or surviving another month. It was war. Mridge stopped sending agents. After that, he started sending problems. One night, Travis found 3 traps laid near the creek, 2 of them snapped closed. Baited with rotting meat meant for animals supposedly, but set where Lenny often walked. Another morning, fair enough trench Lenny had carved was sabotaged. Dammed with rocks so snow melt would soak into the roots and freeze their floor from underneath. They fixed it quietly without asking help, but Lenny didn't just repair it, she improved it. She widened the trench, lined it with flat stones, added a sloped filter bed of sand and ash to prevent freezing altogether. The shelter's temperature stayed 5 warmer from then on. And then came the day the storm hit, the worst snow in 5 years. Maybe 10, winds up to 40. Whole barns collapsed under the weight. The church steeple in black cracked and fell. Settlers tried to ride out for town help and didn't make it past the river, but Lenny and Travis, they were warm, safe, dry. And on the 3rd day of that storm, just before dusk, a knock came at their crooked wooden door, a desperate knock. Travis opened it. It was Jameson Richest, soaked to the skin. Icered, limbs shaking. "My grandson," he said. "We lost heat. The chimney blew off. He's freezing." "My wife," she said. He couldn't finish. He looked like a man stripped of every last piece of pride. Lenny stepped forward, looked him in the eye. "Bring the boy," she said. "Only him. You wait in your wagon." Jameson flinched, then nodded. 20 minutes later, a blanket-wrapped child was passed through the door, face blue-lipped, unconscious. Lenny knelt with him by the fire pit, fed him warm broth, and wrapped him in fur. Never once looked back at the man waiting outside. When morning came, the boy was stable. Lenny stepped outside and set him in Jameson's arms without a word. The old man looked at her, looked at the shelter behind her, looked at Travis, then rode away. They didn't see another Mill Ridge rider all winter, but 3 weeks later, a new structure appeared half-finished on the bluff. Not bark, not tree root, it was stone, fire brick, a strange shape, sloped roof, no chimney. And the design, it matched Anioflin's earlier sketches. Travis held it in his hand one night. The old page she'd once torn from her notebook and burned, or thought she had. She'd shown it to the surveyor. Someone had copied it. And that more than the sabotage, more than the mockery, more than the snow or the theft. That's what finally made her speak with fire in her chest. They can't build what? They don't understand. Travis looked at her. She wasn't just a bride anymore. She was a threat. It was a strange thing in a town like Black to feel powerful from inside a tree. But that's what it had become. The structure everyone once laughed at, called a squirrel shack and joked about at card tables, had turned into the one place everyone seemed to glance toward now when the weather changed, or the wind howled down the canyon. A woman had Medite, a mail-order bride, no less. And that fact alone gnawed at prideful men who thought timber had to come from a sawmill, and heat from a chimney built by stonemasons. But it was working, and power built from success always draws danger. Lenny knew the moment she saw the half-built stone shelter on the bluff. It was not a tribute, it was not flattery, it was a challenge and worse, a message. They had stolen her sketch, but they didn't understand it. The angles were wrong. The draft vents were facing west instead of east. The roof line to steep heat would collection of and burn fuel without efficiency, but it looked right from a distance. And that was enough for those who didn't know better. The Mill Ridges were not trying to build for survival. They were trying to control the narrative. A woman had outbuilt them. Now they needed to erase the proof. The bluff structure was announced as an experimental winter refuge built from new architectural inspiration brought by a visitor from St. Louis. The town paper, funded quietly by mainland interests, ran a short column praising the forward-thinking initiative of local landowners to confront new frontier challenges with ingenuity. No mention of Lenny, not one word. It was like someone had dropped a cloth over her face and told her she never existed. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She did what she always did. Tightened her laces, brushed frost from her bonnet, and went to work. But Travis saw it in her. The betrayal, the insult. She hadn't just built that shelter to survive. She'd built it because it was hers. She had shaped every part with her hands. And no men who had mocked her were not only stealing her ideas. They were claiming they'd invented them. "You want to go tove paper?" Travis asked. "No. She said, "You want a ride up to the bluff?" "No." He stared at her. "Then what?" I went. "Them to come here," she said, "and admit they can't do what I did." Travis frowned. "That'll never happen." "It will," she said, "if I give them something they can't ignore." And that's when she began the expansion. It started with a second chamber, something no one in town had seen. Linny began digging with her hands at first, then fashioned a short-handled spade from an old wagon brace. She cut into the earth beside the root line of the sycamore, working beneath that protective overhang, carefully bracing each inch of excavated space with scavenged wood. She wasn't just making more space, she was building down. "What's the plan?" Travis asked. She didn't answer right away, just kept digging, moving with a rhythm that bordered on something true-like. Finally, she said, "I'm going to show them how to build heat from the ground up, not from stoves, not from wood, but from design." She called it the Earth Sink Chamber. It was deeper than a root cellar, but shaped unlike anything he'd seen. The walls were curved, the floor slightly sloped. She lined the bottom with crushed ash, smoothed mud, packed straw. A fire never touched the chamber, but it felt warmth like a thermos buried in the soil. She showed him how it worked, how heat rose and fell, how the sloped entrance trapped cold air and bounced it away, how a simple set of heated stones above could radiate warmth that slowly filled the lower cavity, making the whole chamber feel like a hidden furnace. "You want to sleep in this?" Heist. "No," she said, "they will." She began drawing again diagrams of how to build a proper earth sink without cracking the root supports. She stitched them into canvas, waterproofed with wax. Travis recognized what she was doing before she said it. "You're going to offer it to them," he said as bait. She nodded. "Not to the male ridges, to everyone else." And that was the turn. She invited the town, not formally, not loudly, but quietly. One neighbor at a team. A word slipped to Mrs. Banner at the apothecary. A hint dropped to the Weir brothers when they passed near Therridge hauling cedar posts. "Come see the shelter," she said. "Bring your wife, bring your children, just for warmth." It took days, but word spread, and then they came. At first, it was just the curious. The ones who'd never believe Ed's stories. They expected a dugout, a smoke pit, maybe a muddy lean-to. But what they saw left them silent, because the tree shelter had changed. It now had two chambers, both insulated, both heated without smoke. The fire pit was replaced by heat-reflecting stones. There were no draft holes, no creaking beams. It felt like a cabin, but moved with the earth like a living thing. Quilt hung. Like insulation, water runoff fed into a filtering bed that kept moisture away. And in the second chamber, the earth sink glowed faintly with a golden warmth that felt unnatural, but was only nature used properly. Children fell asleep in that second chamber without even needing blankets. Old men who'd lost toes to frostbite the year before stepped out red-faced and warm for the first time all winter. Wives went home asking their husbands if they could build something like that, and then came the whispers, "Why can't the Richest model do that? I thought Jameson said his was safer, warmer, better." I heard his stone one cracked in the last freeze. It all began to unravel. By February, the Mail Ridge Bluff shelter had been abandoned. Fuels had split from moisture retention. One of the brick vents collapsed. The fire smoke kept backing up because they had misunderstood Lynn's original angle design. No one used it anymore. And then, like a hand slamming down on Annabelle, Jameson Richest himself came riding down again. But this time, he didn't come to buy, he came to demand. He arrived midday without his usual entourage, alone on a black mare, dressed in a thick coat and wool gloves. His face looked pale, thinner than before, like the cold had reached inside him and left something hollow. He didn't wait at the slope. He rode all the way in. Travis met him at the edge of the shelter's clearing, shotgun resting over own shoulder. Linny was working beneath the overhang, checking runoff channels. Jameson dismounted slowly, his boots scrunched on the frosted dirt. "I want the designs," he said. "Whatever you're doing here, it's dangerous. People are starting to think they don't need proper builders, that they can just dig holes and live like moles." Travis said nothing, just spat in the dirt. Jameson's eyes slid to Lenny. "This is frontier land. He said sharply, and what you're doing undermines stability. My family built this valley. You think some girl who married in by post can just change everything? Lenny stood up, wiped her hands, walked toward him until they were less than 3 feet apart. I didn't marry the valley, she said. I married him. Jameson's face turned red. You think this will last? He barked. Let a couple more storms roll through. See if that root house keeps standing. You want to bet your life on Bark Endert? Lynn's voice was calm. We already did. Jameson stared at her. You'll regret this. He said. No, she said. You will. And he left. The next week, someone burned down the Ware brothers' barn. No one could prove anything, but everyone knew who lit the torch. The brothers had visited Lynn's shelter 3 times. They'd taken oaths, begun building something similar near the base of their hill. Their new wall, earth-insulated, root-supported, had drawn notice, and then their barn went up, black bestirred. Because when winter is hard and shelter is scarce, and the man with the biggest house starts burning down smaller ones, people take notice. They begin turning toward tree shelter, not just for warmth, but for guidance. Lenny never spoke publicly, but one woman's comment at that trading post said more than any speech. She didn't build that place for show. She built it because she knew we'd need it, and one by one, they came to her not for blueprints or construction help, but to learn how to angle runoff trenches, how to insulate without sawmill timber, how to warm a space without venting smoke, how to stay alive without wood piles 10 feet high. Lenny taught them quietly, carefully, and without charging a dime. By spring Thor, 3 other homes had adopted partial versions of her system, not as hidden, not as elegant, but warm, safe. Feblev Estate remained untouched, and Jameson, he stopped showing his face in town. Because every time he did, someone would nod toward the cottonwood slope, toward the squirrel shack that had outlasted his pride. That night, Travis and Lenny sat under a sky dripping with melt. The snow was retreating, the earth smelled alive again, and the wind gnawing her stung. You won, Travis said. No, she said, voice low. We survived. That's enough, but in her lap was a fresh sketchbook. Because she wasn't done, not by a long shot. By the time spring had fully broken across the valley, the cottonwood stood tall and full again, casting long shadows across the ridge where the shelter lay nestled, like it had grown straight out of the earth. Wild mint pushed up through the melt-soaked soil. The runoff trench scriggled soft. With the last of the snow melt, everything about the slope felt alive, like something breathing beneath bark and root, stirred not by the wind, but by the quiet will of the woman who had bent it to her purpose. Lenny didn't celebrate. She never had. She wasn't the kind of person to crow or boast or even accept praise easily. But that didn't mean she didn't know what she had accomplished. By now, even the most stubborn settlers in black had hardo. Her tree shelter survived a winter that cracked chimneys and swallowed roofs. Some still muttered half-heartedly that she'd gotten lucky, or that any real man could have done the same if he had time, but their words had lost bite, worn down by their own wives' pointed looks, by the quiet grip of cold that they still remembered in their bones. Even the ones who mocked her now did it less like men spitting venom and more like men trying to soothe their own bruised egos. They weren't laughing anymore. But the male ridges weren't forgetting either, because for all Thessalons, that came after Jameson's last visit. For all the weeks when no rider showed at the edge of the slope, Lenny felt it, that awful weight of something waiting, not gone, not over, just withdrawing, like a storm building back in the hills. She didn't tell Travis at first, not when she found a fresh footprint near the creek's south line where no neighbor would have stepped. Not when she saw a new carving in the bark of a cottonwood tree, a small MGD, crude but deliberate, left facing her shelter's hidden water catch. And not even when she spotted a reflection, just a flicker of glass on the bluff at dusk, like someone watching from behind a scope. It was Travis who finally said it out loud. They ain't done. Lenny just nodded, then, without another word, she began reinforcing the shelter again. She thickened the thatch lining of the ceiling, not because it needed more warmth, but because it needed more protection. She redug the runoff trenches wider, Added a second outlet so no one could dam the water flow from a single side. She buried the sketchbooks in an oilcloth wrapped tin under the secondary chamber, covered it with a stone plate and layers of dirt so thick not even a pickaxe could find it, unless they knew where to look. They could take the shelter, she said one night, but they won't take the knowledge. Travis said nothing, just watched her with something close to awe. The woman he'd sent for by post had arrived small, quiet, and unreadable. What stood before him now was steel wrapped in bark, the kind of woman who knew what to do with a knife and a frost line. Who could turn a tree into a fortress and a pile of runoff into a warning system? And she'd done it without firing a shot, but even she couldn't stop what came next. Because there are two kinds of men who can't stand being outdone. Those who vanish and those who strike back hard enough to make the world forget who beat them. James and Richest had no intention of vanishing. The first sign was subtle. The surveyor returned. Same one who'd passed through in winter. But this time, he didn't knock on their shelter door. He went straight to the bluff, met with Jameson's sons, walked at the edge of the ridge with a fresh map book and a thick iron rangefinder. He didn't ride past Travis's land, didn't look down at the tree shelter, even once. And when he left 2 days later, he did so with 2 rolled tubes of sealed parchment, plans likely. Something formal. Then came the second sign, a land boundary dispute, filed quietly at county office using a loophole from an old property line sketch that hadn't been touched in over 15 years. Jameson claimed the slope where the shelter sat was improperly surveyed, that Travis's claim extended 50 feet too far east, overlapping an unclaimed water channel. In plain terms, he was trying to take the land out from under them. The document arrived in early May, folded, stamped, sealed by the county clerk's office in Little Jasper. Linny opened it with fingers that didn't shake, not even once. Travis read it in silence, then looked up at her. "They're trying to bleed us through ink. They're trying to make us choose," she said. "Choose what? Fight in court or leave quietly?" Hestered at her. "You want to fight. I want to win." But there was a catch. They had no lawyer, no money for one either. And Jamison knew that, which meant the bluff had decided that if theft didn't work and fire didn't scare them off, then paperwork would. He was playing the long game now, the respectable game, the kind that didn't leave ash on your boots. Only one thing could stop it: evidence. They needed proof. Not just that the land was theirs, but that the Malloridges had knowingly sabotaged them before. They needed witnesses, people willing to speak, stand up, say what they saw. And that's when Linny realized what the last winter had truly built. Not just a shelter, not even a reputation. It had built community. It started with the Weir brothers. When Travis told them what was happening, they didn't hesitate. Rode with him straight to the notary office and swore to the winter sabotage. How they'd seen mail riders near the slope. How their own barn burned after they copied Lynn's designs. Then came Mrs. Banner. She signed an affidavit confirming the Malloridges had mocked Lynn's work in public and then tried to purchase its secret lines. The storm broke. Even the blacksmith's apprentice, just a boy, barely 16, came forward with a statement. Said he'd been hired to copy Lynn's runoff trench for the bluff property, then threatened to keep quiet when he told them it didn't function right. Within a week, they had 6 signed statements. By the end of the second week, 12, and each one told accurate truth. The Malloridges weren't just angry that a woman had outbuilt them. They were afraid because if a girl from Pittsburgh, armed with nothing but bark, mud, and old sketches, could build something the richest men in the valley could not, then their power wasn't rooted in wisdom or strength or legacy. It was rooted in pretense. And pretense couldn't survive when the truth stood right in front of it and didn't move. The court date was set. 3rd week of June, Little Jasper Town Hall. Linny didn't wear anything fancy, just her some old wool skirt, patched shawl, and gloves with worn-out thumbs. She sat beside Travis. Chin high, eyes level, no makeup, no polished boots, just presents. Jameson came in last, dressed in a black coat and silk vest, gold chain dangling from his watch pocket. He didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the room full of townsfolk who had followed them across the county line to witness the hearing. The judge asked for opening statements. Jameson's lawyer delivered a long, wordy argument about land rights, old maps, and water boundaries. He used terms like precedent and proprietary structure placements. Then Linny stood. She didn't have a lawyer, didn't need one. She unrolled a diagram, hand-drawn, precise, and instantly familiar to half the room, her original sketch. The one that had somehow ended up copied on the bluff. The one no one believed still existed. I made this before I ever saw black, she said. Every line of it came from years of studying, building, and surviving. They didn't create it, they stole it. Just like they're trying to steal the land we built our home on. Then she laid the second sheet Bessidite. A signed survey from a traveling clerk dated the winter before. The one who'd stayed during the blizzard. His signature confirmed their location, the slope, the runoff, the structure exactly where it stood. And then she laid out statements, 12 in total. The judge read them slowly, silently. Jameson never looked up, but his face cracked, not with rage, not with fear, with recognition. He'd lost by the end of the hearing. The judge not only threw out the male claim, but ordered them to pay restitution. Fees for legal harassment, not a fortune, but a statement, and in the small world of black, a statement echoed louder than law. When they returned home, Linny didn't celebrate. She climbed the slope, sat beside the runoff trench, watched the water trickle through the sand. Travis joined her. You all right? She nodded. He waited, then asked softly, was this what you wanted? She looked out over the horizon. I didn't want this, she said. I just wanted to build something true. Something that worked, and you did, he said. She looked at him. So did you. He frowned. What do you mean? You sent for me, she said. You gave me this tree. You gave me space. He smiled faintly. Didn't seem like much of a gift at the time. It was everything, she said. No one else would have believed a shelter like this could stand. But you didn't laugh. Wasn't anything funny about it, he said. They sat together in silence as the evening wind rolled down the slope, brushing the grass and rattling the high branches like lullabies. Somewhere far off, a bird called. The air smelled of green. It wasn't over. It never really would be. But for now, the land was quiet, and in the dirt, beneath a sycamore, older than every man in town, the shelter still stood, its walls packed, its roof sealed, its roots deep. A place no one could take because it had never belonged to anyone else. By midsummer, the tree shelter had become more than just a home. It had become a symbol, an act of quiet rebellion, built not with bullets or bold speeches, but with bark, dirt, and stubborn will. And like all symbols born of struggle, it began to outgrow the hands that had shaped it. Linny never intended to lead anything. That wasn't her nature. She hadn't come west to organize movements or inspire town folk. She'd come because Pittsburgh had tried to crush the parts of her that thought differently. Because ants and overseers and factory walls had all taught her that her ideas were foolish, unless a man claimed them. But out here, under the thick canopy of cottonwoods, her silence had become a lesson. Her shelter, once mocked as a joke, had turned into a kind of whispered unswordo, a question none of them had ever asked aloud. What if everything we were told about how to survive out here was wrong? She and Travis lived simply that summer. No extra coin came from the hearing's outcome, no reward for lasting a rich man's pride. But something else came in its place. People, not all at once and not in crowds, but steady, quietly, like snow melt seeping through stone. A woman with her child in tow, asking if Linny might teach her how to reinforce a dugout wall. A teenager wanting to know how she bent tree limbs without cracking the grain. A man from Two Valleys over who brought a sketch of his own, clumsy but sincere, and asked if she might take a look. And Linny, who had never felt welcome in the rooms built by other people, began to open hers. They never charged, not once. Travis refused the idea, even when men offered coin. If you want to pay, he said, bring bark, bring lumber, bring a shovel, and dig something with her. That's how the tree folk were born. It was never a real group, never had a name. They spoke aloud. But others started calling them that behind their backs. Neighbors who had taken up some piece of Lynn's design. Folks whose shelters were now half-dug or bark-up supported or run-off channeled. You could tell them apart after a while, not because they looked the same, but because they worked the land differently. They walked slower around trees, planted deeper trenches, talked more about design than timber, and that new way of thinking. It spread. Biodome. 5 new shelters had gone up across Black and the surrounding valleys, all with pieces of Lynn's design. One couple built theirs inside a split hollow where a lightning strike had cracked a cottonwood a decade earlier. Another woman buried her structure 3/4 deep in a hillside and used sunstone reflectors to warm fuels. None were perfect, none were identical, but they all had one thing in common. They kept people warm. And that winter, no one died of exposure, not a single soul. It had never happened before in the valley's history, and word began to travel. The spring after, a rider from Missouri came with a letter bearing the seal of a fledgling frontier settlement cooperative, some outfit funded by a rail tycoon's daughter with ideas about homesteading reform. They heard stories about a woman engineer in the Black region who'd built a storm-proof structure from trees. Wanted to meet her, ask questions, take measurements. Lenny turned them away, not unkindly, but firmly. I built this shelter to survive, she said. Not to be sold. Still, the letter confirmed something no court hearing could. People were listening, but not everyone was grateful. The male Richest hadn't spoken a word since the ruling. Jameson had withdrawn. Seldom seen outside his estate, his sons ran the bluff now. Though running was generous, much of their work had become retribution disguised as law. They filed appeals to unrelated border lines, fought over creek access rights, blocked a few fence lines belonging to those who had supported Lenny at the hearing. Quiet, ugly pressure. It didn't scare her, but it wore on the town until the flood came. It was late spring when the mountains thawed faster than expected. Heavy rain hit the high ridge, sending water tearing down gullies and choking dry channels that hadn't run deep in years. Cabins went under before dawn, livestock drowned. The creek North Mail Ridge Bluff burst its banks and the bluff home collapsed, not from water, from design. The outer supports had been carved to shallow. The reflecting wall Jameson insisted on installing without understanding runoff principles cracked, diverted water directly into the foundation, and because the main chimney had been built over a patch of unstable stone, it fell, crushing the front porch and 2 rooms beneath. Miraculously, Noon was killed, but Jameson Ridge was injured, a broken leg, 2 ribs, a gash to the head. They said he'd been in the main room when the front buckled, had to be dug out by his own hands before the rest came down. The town took it as a sign, not of vengeance, but of truth. The richest man in the valley had fallen to the same weather that Lynn's helter had been designed to defeat, and no one laughed when the Ridge family days later sent a message, handwritten and humbly phrased, to ask Lenny if they could shelter temporarily on the land she'd once been mocked for living on. Travis brought the letter in that evening, set it on the table like something fragile. Lenny read it, set it down, then stared at the fire a long while. "You want to let them come?" Travis asked. She didn't answer right away. Then the boy, the one who was sick last winter. Travis nodded. "Eli. He can come," she said, "and the mother. The rest can find their own routes." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity, because some people build to live, and some live to own what others built. And when you make no distinction between that, you invite the same collapse that takes roofs and foundations alike. They took the child in again. Set him in Thescan chamber, let him rest. The mother wept and tried to thank Lenny, who only nodded and handed her a heated stone wrapped in wool. She didn't do it to forgive. She did it because she knew if no one took the child in, they'd only grow up to repeat it all. By summer's end, the tree shelter had been copied in 7 valleys. The word tree folk began to take on new meaning, not a mockery, not a joke, a blueprint, a way of life. Quiet, simple, resilient. The land changed with it. So did the people. And somewhere beneath that great old sycamore, its roots drinking deep from runoff water, channeled with care and foresight, a woman sat each morning with a fresh sheet of paper and a stub of charcoal. Still drawing, still planning. Not for fame, not for reward. But for those who hadn't yet been taught that shelter isn't about the wood or the roof or the nails. It's about the will to make something stand, no matter hollis, no matter who threatens, no matter how cold the storm. And in the town of Black, they never called it the Squirrel Shack again. They called it the First. And in time, the stories would say that when the settlers came to laugh at his mail-order bride's tree shelter, thinking it was a foolish thing, a joke, what they'd really come to see was the future. But by the time they realized it, she'd already built it and left them to catch up.